write down the to-do list so that it's off of your mind, but then set aside some time for engaging in leisure. I won't say activity, but engaging in this leisure, right? Maybe it's reading, maybe it's writing, maybe it's taking the things that you read earlier this week and actually going through and commonplacing a few things, or playing a musical instrument, something that is just good in and of itself.
Welcome to Scholé Sisters, the podcast for the classical homeschooling mama who seeks to learn and grow while she's helping her children learn and grow. Scholé Sisters is a casual conversation about topics that matter to those of us in the trenches of classical homeschooling who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. I'm your host, Brandy Venzel. You can find me over at afterthoughtsblog.net, spreading my Charlotte Mason joy through blog posts, study guides, audios, and more. My co-hosts today are Abby Wall and Misty Winkler. Abby is basically the queen of the Scholé sistership. Abby is a country-living farmer, rancher, a loving wife, and mom of 5 who homeschools and reads whenever she can. Misty is a second-generation homeschooler with 5 kids and too many projects. With her blog, podcast, and membership, she helps you organize your attitude so you can organize your life. Find her over at simplyconvivial.com. So, what is Scholé anyway? What gives with using such a weird Greek word? We have a short, free guide to understanding what Scholé is and how to get some in your life and homeschool. We want to make Scholé approachable and practical. Scholé is more than reading and more than restful learning. It's an approach and an attitude. Our beginner's guide to Scholé will help you jumpstart your own Scholé practices. Find it right on the front page of our website for free at scholésisters.com. Today's episode is our attempt to answer the question of what is Scholé and how do I know if I'm doing it right? Is Scholé just restful learning, or is there more to it than that? These are interesting questions to tackle, and so without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our Scholé every day. Who'd like to go first?
I can.
All right.
This is Abby, and I am finishing up David Howarth's 1066, The Year of the Conquest.
Oh.
And it's a short but meaty little book. It's under 200 pages. No, it's about 200 pages. And it is about the Norman Conquest. I had a little bit of this, historically, just from like my kids' books and things like that. But I wanted to go a little more in depth. And this was like the right amount of, like 200 pages. It was good. And so it goes through kind of the year and what led up to it. But the writer is surprisingly funny. And some of it's, kind of boring and dry, but he throws in these little sentences every once in a while, and it's just interesting. So for the most part, I would say it's very, not necessarily entertaining, but informative. And it's got some very witty and funny little interjections. So one of the quotes is, "To be king of France would have been a safer ambition. Napoleon and Hitler only attempted the conquest of England after conquering the rest of Europe, not before." And he just has some interesting things about like why the Englishmen were going to fail. At this time, not everyone had bows and arrows, and it was like the nobles who had their, Fletchers, and they had these people who would make their bows and but it was very guarded, because if you had admitted to having a bow and arrow, you would basically named a poacher, because hunting rights and regulations and things like that were so carefully guarded. And how the Normans had these horses that were just bred for battle and ready and all these things, and all of these like kind of farming and things like that. They had basically shaggy ponies. And one of the quotes is, "A Norman knight was obliged by his feudal duty to ride his horse into battle, but an English thane was not, and he would have needed a lot of persuading. So would his horse." So he just has little tidbits and just kind of funny little comments that makes it interesting. And he's giving, like, right now he's talking about the Vikings and kind of their contribution towards it. So we're leading up to when it was going to happen. So it's been interesting. I've been talking to my husband a lot about it. So that's always good.
We classify this as history with snide remarks.
Yes.
Nice.
And just funny little things. So.
Misty, what about you?
I have Martianus Capella and the Seven Liberal Arts, Volume 2, The Marriage of Philology and Mercury.
Fancy.
So this is a title for my NSA class on the history of classical education. So it's early medieval period. Capella put together this book, and it was used as a textbook for the liberal arts in the early period. I'm going to get this wrong, but like the 1000s to 1200s, thereabouts. But it starts off, and it's such a medieval allegory. It's hilarious. So there's a section where each liberal art is given a speech, basically, at the wedding ceremony of philology, or learning, and Mercury. And in their time that they get to give their speech, they explain what is basic to their purview. Grammar gives a speech, dialectic gives a speech, astronomy gives a speech. They all give a speech that is the knowledge inherent in that category. But before you get there, it's the betrothal and marriage ceremony of Mercury, who is the god of eloquence primarily here. And philology was mortal and has to be made immortal in order to be wed to eloquence. And it's very elaborate and very flowery. It was funny in one section that's about rhetoric and elegance. Capella takes a comment from Quintilian about language being, or speeches being, ornate, and uses it as a positive, but in Quintilian it's actually a negative. So anyway, it's interesting, but it's interesting also to see what the early medievals thought grammar was, and what dialectic was, and what you studied when you were studying grammar and dialectic and all these things.
I bet.
It's worth wading through, and there are little bits that are funny. So before philology is allowed to become immortal, she's weighed down by all her learning, so she can't rise up. And so the goddess helping her become immortal gives her, I'm going to say the word wrong, a purgative.
Uh-huh.
So she vomits out books and leaves them on earth before she rises to the heavens.
Wow. Was she reading a lot of twaddle, or?
The girl strained hard and with great effort vomited up the weight she was carrying. Then that nausea and labor vomit turned into a stream of writings of all kind.
I feel like we should paint this as a picture and label it much, not many.
Yeah.
And that's while the maiden was bringing up such matter in spasms, several young women, of whom some are called the arts and other disciplines, were straightway collecting whatever the maiden brought forth from her mouth.
Wow.
That is just a picture.
Sure is.
Like, where's the medieval art of this story?
Yeah. I'm missing the vomit painting.
Yeah. Where's the tapestry of this?
Yep.
Little
Exactly.
vomit, little puddles of books.
I feel like we need to design a cross stitch for the 2021 Christmas gift.
Or at
Philology's
least
book vomit.
Brandy's a statue meme.
Yes. Oh, wow. Huh.
So it's full of fun little allegorical gems.
I guess so. I feel like I could read it just for that. Wow. Mine is not quite so fancy. So I thought I would highlight here a read aloud we're doing right now because I am really enjoying it. And I don't know, I guess it was just the cover. I had kind of low expectations when I picked it up, but it seemed like something the children would like. And I knew it was one of the favorites of my oldest when he was the age of my youngest. So I thought, well, I'll try it. And it's super good. I really like it. So this is Rolf and the Viking Bow by Alan French. And my oldest collected I don't know if they were considered YA fiction when they were written because they're kind of older fiction books. But anyway, my oldest collected, I don't know, 3 or 4 of Alan French's books that when I looked at them, they all look like they're kind of this Viking-ish kind of time period. I could be wrong about that. I mean, I'm just judging by the covers, which is probably a bad decision, but I maintain. So Rolf and the Viking Bow, the boy in here is, what is he? I want to say he's about 15, I guess. And there's sort of this coming of age theme where his father ends up dying. And so he's having to take over being the man of the house, basically. But there's a lot of controversy surrounding his father's death. And I don't want to give a bunch of spoilers, but it is super good. And what I find interesting, though, is that his dad, so this is taking place, the historical backdrop of this book is taking place when Iceland has become Christianized, sort of. So there's definitely been conversions taking place. And so Rolf's mom is definitely a Christian. And Rolf's dad, what's his name? Hierandi or something like that. He too, I would say, just from a couple comments he made, he's not in the book very long, but from a couple comments, I would say he was like trying to learn to live a Christian life. But there was kind of this tension between what a Christian would actually do and the bulk of the traditions that have been in their country for a long time. So a good example is that their house is on the top of this cliff overlooking the ocean. And the long-standing tradition was that they got to collect basically like the booty, I guess you would call it, but like from the ships that wrecked on the rocks. And that was one of the primary sources of their wealth, was to go down there and gather up all this stuff after a storm. And his wife convinced him to light the first beacon. So the father becomes known as like the first man to light a beacon to help sailors instead of, the opposite, which would be to hope that they wreck on your rock so that you get their stuff. So anyway, it's a super interesting little peek at maybe what some of that stuff would have been like. And the story's super good. And the language, it's well written. It's fun to read aloud and all that. So we're having a good time. And it's one of those little books where you find yourself thinking about things afterwards because there's just embedded some basic ideas of things like human nature and the idea that what is the right thing to do isn't always the easiest thing to do. It's been a good source of conversation and I'm super happy with it. So like I said, I kind of just grabbed it off the shelf because I we haven't done this one. And I didn't have anything lined up. I usually have a stack, but we had made it to the bottom of my stack, but ended up being a great choice. So highly recommended. Who knew?
I see that it's on Audible and I have a credit, so I might just get that for my kids.
All right. Making it a real podcast episode.
Yeah.
I think buying an Audible still counts as baptizing the podcast. So
sorry, Misty, yours I might have to borrow from you later.
Yeah.
Mine was not necessarily a recommended purchase.
I would buy the cross stitch though.
I think you're going to have to design the cross stitch.
I think they have like those online things now that have like little grids and you can X them as like a plan. I was trying to think. I'm not sure I'm talented enough for that.
I know I'm not. Actually, I'm not patient enough to do that.
I'm tempted to try just because I think it would be hilarious. But anyway, probably a bad use of my time.
Hi, Abby here to give you an inside look into the community we call the Sistership. It is a place for homeschooling moms to gather and engage in meaningful and fruitful conversation. Become a supporter of the podcast and a Scholé Sister Insider. Supporters have access to everything in the free membership, plus extra and exclusive podcast recordings. You can join mom-led book clubs or even lead your own. You can build friendships around the challenges with virtual meetups, and you can learn and laugh more with the Scholé Sisters cutting room floor clips. Homeschooling is so much more than the daily grind. As a supporter, you will find the camaraderie and inspiration to keep you engaged in a project of true education for yourself and for your kids. Go to scholésisters.com/sistership and become a supporter today.
Okay, so let us transition to our topical discussion. We're going to tackle what Scholé is again. 15th time is a charm. I'm not sure how many times we've done it, so I just pulled that number out of the air. Today, we are using Only the Lover Sings by Joseph Pieper, the podcast's favorite author. The podcast has a favorite author, it's Joseph Pieper. And we're using chapter 1 of this book only, because that is the only chapter of this book I've read.
The real reason she said chapter 1.
But Misty and I have read the whole thing, we can use other parts.
Fancy pants. Well, I will say this, though. When I was looking at it, I thought, well, I'm sure the other chapters will help, but there's actually a lot in this chapter, and where it's not supposed to be a 2-hour episode. So it seemed safe to say, let's stick with chapter 1. We're going to talk again about what Scholé is, what its requirements are. And Misty, I think you named this Beyond Restful Learning. And I really liked that. And in fact, the more I contemplated, because that's Scholé, the more I contemplated what was in the chapter, the more I came away with that I think some of our pictures of Scholé being equal to restful learning might be a little bit off. You can tell me if I'm wrong.
Well, you mean fully equivalent to? It's not the entirely. It's not the sum.
Exactly. I think that's the thing, is that there is a temptation to say Scholé, write it like a math equation. Scholé equals restful learning, period, the end.
So if you are learning in a restful way, then you have Scholé.
Right. I think really the question we're coming around is like, what is it and how do I know if I have it? Or am I doing it wrong?
Mm-hmm. Well, and we see people, and even we sometimes it's like, well, is this really it, or am I really doing it? And it feels abstract or theoretical and not doable and hard to nail down. But if it's what we're supposed to be doing, then
yes,
we need to know what it is and how.
Right. Well, and I would like, by the way, by the end of this, I would like to know if doing a cross stitch of book vomit would be Scholé. So
I think you have to be contemplating the imagery the whole time you're doing it.
Okay. I'm willing to do that. So who wants to take a stab at an initial, what is Scholé? Bonus points if you quote Pieper.
Well, I think the first thing is the name of this chapter or this essay is Work, Spare Time, and Leisure. And I think Pieper does a great job of differentiating what those are and how in our society, in modern society, it's so much work focused and leisure is such kind of an abstract and not a common use. Oftentimes it's synonymous with spare time, but that's not what it really is. Mm-hmm. So work is that active effort, and spare time is the span of time not filled with work. And then leisure is that it's longing. He uses the phrase like longing for something other. We've talked about it before, like festive time and holiday, engaging in leisure. It can be experiential. It can be a lot of different things, but like, it's not just a lack of work. Neither is it just recreation or entertainment or something we do so that we have energy to go back to work.
Right. I thought it was interesting in this section that he distinguishes leisure or Scholé or festivity, celebration as something that is good in itself.
Yes.
Whereas work is a useful good, Scholé is a good in itself.
Yeah. On 21, he says, how should we conceive of such an activity that does not need something other for its justification, that is not defined as producing useful goods and objective results?
Yes.
And then he goes on to say, but is existential realization itself an activity in which man's true and proper good, his genuine richness, fullest life, and most perfect happiness is attained? It sounds to me, well, this is not a quote, but like he's really getting at the idea that Scholé is the apprehension of truth.
And contemplation of it.
And contemplation of it. Yeah. So you apprehend it, and then if you can hold on long enough, you can think about it. That's where I have trouble. I'm like, I got it. I don't got it.
Well, or even that distinction between work and rest, where, my husband likes to give me a hard time because he says, if Scholé is contemplation, that sure sounds like work to me.
Well, my husband finally asked me, he's like, okay, so what is Scholé? What is this word? I said, well, it technically means leisure. And he just started laughing. So, and then, going on to explain it. But that's the thing, like coming up with definitions. But I mean, once we talked about it a little bit, and then, he's like, okay, so not kicking up your feet and kicking back, but actually, I can't remember quite how he phrased it, but it was probably something very pithy and made sense because that's how he does it. And then he moves on. So definition's good. But it was interesting having that conversation explaining this because it is hard to put a finger on. Like it would be so nice to just be like, well, this is what it is and this is what it isn't. But
right. But it does feel like it eludes definition sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And like on page 25, where he says, not without our own efforts.
Yes.
So there really is work in a way. There's effort, right? So I think he's using work as like work day, providing for basic needs. He's not saying that Scholé is without effort.
Right.
It's not without our own efforts, but nevertheless not through those efforts. It cannot be accomplished except with an attitude of receptive openness and attentive silence, which is the exact opposite of the worker's attitude, marked by concentrated exertion. Which, I'm fond of always pointing out that all reading isn't the only definition, only Scholé activity, and not all reading is Scholé.
Right.
Reading and Scholé are not at all synonymous. And so as I was reading through this chapter, I was thinking about that and how it's not that the activity of reading is Scholé so much as if we don't read, how can we Scholé? How can we have anything to contemplate and think about? And I think it's after we read that we are then able and likely to experience those connections and mysteries, as he calls them.
And I think that's why the wide reading approach that we try to encourage, I think that's why that is helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say I just read all one kind of book. And I kind of did this when I was younger. I spent a lot of time reading just educational philosophy. And it's not a bad thing, but I think it's actually when you start reading other things that you're making those connections across disciplines that start to help you apprehend kind of like a fullness of truth.
Yeah.
That you don't get when you're specializing so much. And I don't want to say there's never a place to specialize, but I think that's why wide reading can be so helpful when we're talking about Scholé, is you have a way bigger variety, difference of perspectives, difference of application. Like you have all of that to draw on. And that's super helpful.
Yeah. I've been thinking about Scholé as the ordering of affections, right? And shaping our loves and our appetites. So I've been reading through the Bible on a, year-long plan or whatever. And for the last couple of years, I find that when I'm actually reading and not just doing audio Bible, because some days it just gets hectic and it's just nice to be able to listen and, do other things. But when I actually read and look at the words on the page, I find that Sunday worship is actually easier. And I'm finding when I am reading more, that actually going to church and staying focused and having that focused attention, I'm able to have more attention. And I think it's partly because when you're reading and you are taking time, and it could be other things too, not just reading, but I find that when I'm actually attentive, contemplating, beholding true, good, and beautiful things, then that translates itself into other parts of my life. Just like when we get too busy to do those reading or time for Scholé every day, or even a lot of prayer just because it's so busy, that isn't good for us. Like it's if we're too busy to pause for a moment and pray, we get more and more frantic. But taking the time to pray and really read my Bible, it's shaping and ordering, and it's changing my appetites.
I found it interesting on page 19 where he says that loafing is the exact opposite of engaging in leisure, just because I assumed that loafing and work were opposites.
Right.
And that leisure was like, I almost put it as like, it's just its own category. So you have this on and off switch of work and doing nothing, but that's really not how he put it.
Well, and he says that the loafing and recreation, entertainment, amusement, play is not leisure, but it's the only thing that can be done with spare time, with non-work time, if you are in that world and mindset of total worker's world.
Was it Orwell where there's that quote going around? Is it from, I'm trying to remember. It's about how everything became illegal except for work.
And on page 23, he asks that question: what constitutes here and now an activity meaningful in and of itself? I have stated it before. If we are unable to answer this question, then we will also be unable to resist convincingly the claims of a world absolutely defined by work. And he goes on to answer. The answer contained in our Western philosophical tradition could be summed up in this way. Whenever in reflective and receptive contemplation we touch, even remotely, the core of all things, the hidden ultimate reason of the living universe, the divine foundation of all that is, the purest form of all archetypes. And in parentheses, it says, and the act of perception immersed in contemplation is the most intensive form of grasping and owning. Whenever and wherever we thus behold the very essence of reality, there is an activity that is meaningful in itself taking place.
That was one of the things I wrote down as a possible definition of Scholé.
Mm-hmm.
Beholding the very essence of reality.
And then after that section, he goes to a few different kinds of contemplations or activities that allow us to contemplate the essence of reality, things that are meaningful in itself, where he says religious meditation, philosophical reflection.
And I love what he said about that anybody can ponder human deeds and basically it's not like you have to be a professional philosopher. Anybody can contemplate the big truths of life. I thought that was nice, because some of the other things, it's like, well, I might not be in a place where I could do that, like the art stuff, which I know you're going to go on and read, but.
Right. Yeah. Anyone can ponder human deeds and happenings. The creation of the artist, and all of these are contemplation of eternal archetypes. That's what he means by leisure.
He includes experiencing the spark of poetry while listening to it, beholding a sculpture and perceiving the artist's intention. So I guess that is also accessible to those of us who are not artists.
Yeah, it's not just doing art, it's also beholding art.
I think it is helpful to remember that for those of us who do write or create art, that it's possible that those things are Scholé. Probably depends on what exactly we're doing. I'm thinking like in modern art where you're making an expression of self, I don't think that would count. Just because I am not an eternal truth, and contemplating me is not contemplating, it's not apprehending truth. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
But it is possible to create art that is intended to be very Scholé. I think that's helpful because I think sometimes, this is just me personally, but when I'm in a time where I'm writing a lot more, even if it's very Scholé, I can start to feel like, well, I'm not really doing Scholé because I haven't read as much lately and I haven't. And it's that whole learning equals Scholé, books equals Scholé equation that I'm tapping into that's not exactly quite right on that is causing the problem, because the writing can be very much part of the Scholé process, but I'm discounting it because of that previous notion that I had that I haven't quite let go of.
Well, and it can be because your writing isn't actually producing a product, right? Because if it's just writing for the sake of thinking through an idea and it's not turning into something else like a blog post or something, then it doesn't feel like it's a productive use of time. Is that part of it?
I think that's part of it too, but I really think even more is just that early on, I kind of adopted reading equals Scholé and more reading equals more Scholé. And I didn't really leave room in my definition for like the thinking, contemplating part of it. And so just anytime where I'm pausing in that way, even if I'm doing something that can technically be measured, like writing, you could actually track how many words you were writing if you wanted to. I never do, but I know some writers do that. But I'm just saying, like, I think for me, it's just I bought into that false equation. Really, that's the root of the issue for me.
But that's why I think things like taking walks and that sort of thing ought not be undervalued. Those activities that just give you the time and space to contemplate, to let the connections happen in your mind.
Yeah. So here he says basically, this is on page 24. Those who only listen and observe, as long as the conditions are right, can also touch in contemplation the core of all reality, the domain of the eternal archetypes. And then he says, if the conditions are right, here lies the difficulty. Which is so true, because I was thinking about even the walk thing that you just said. A walk can be Scholé, but it could not be Scholé. Writing can be Scholé, but it might not be Scholé. Like all these different things. It's all about the conditions for him. And I found that super helpful, the conditions that he laid out. Do you guys care if I read them really quick?
No, please
Go
do.
for it.
So I think I only saw two, really. So one was attitude and receptive openness and attentive silence. And then two was the ability to celebrate a feast. So we probably should back up and talk about one before we talk about two. This attitude of openness, of receptive openness and attentive silence seems to me like at this point, the reading has stopped, right?
Yeah, or it's that you read a line and you pause.
Yeah,
it's not just powering through.
Where do you guys find that in your life?
Well, I have a house that's not very silent ever.
That's kind of why I asked, actually, because I think a lot of us are in that position.
Yeah, no. Well, I'm a morning person, so I do like getting up early in the morning. And I have found that writing out by hand commonplace quotes is a really good way to think about something a little bit longer. I used to, like kind of go and look for the quotes and then just copy and paste and kind of keep a track of them there. But I find that the actual slowness of writing it down, it sticks with me longer, and I actually think about it throughout the day. And walking without any information coming in. I mean, I like to listen to audiobooks or podcasts when I'm on walks, but there are days where I just need the quiet space. And so I just leave my phone at home and I go on a walk. I used to do it all the time before, smartphones, but now it's like, almost automatic bringing my phone with me. But at least a couple times a week, I try to leave it at home so that I can just not have any It's the distraction box.
Yeah. What about you, Misty?
Yeah, the walking. I think even times like chopping vegetables or doing dishes or folding laundry, those activities that require repetitive action but don't require your mind are times where your mind is free to then wander and connect. Or even, handwork. I think, at least for me, it's not that the handwork itself is Scholé. It's art, in a way, I suppose, but it's really more of a thing for the hands to be doing so that my mind is better able to just roam and think and connect.
It's like The grown-up version of the little boy pushing the cars around during the read aloud,
Yeah.
I think.
Or the coloring. Yeah.
Yeah. Handwork looks way cooler and more mature than car pushing. So, you just made an argument for my philology vomit cross stitch, by the way. Wanted to point that out. So I think for me, I often find quiet, contemplative sorts of time actually late at night after everyone goes to bed. I do not have any teenagers that like to stay up late right now.
Woohoo.
Which is kind of like a weird thing, but I don't. And so we kind of have quiet evenings right now after about 8:30 or so. And not that I always use them in the best ways, but when I do, I realize, I actually do have time for these things. Like I have time I can capitalize on that is fairly quiet. So I've been trying to do that more as the days have felt quite full.
And I think also it's that interior space
that
needs the proper conditions. We need to discover what is unconditioning or deconditioning ourselves. There are just a lot of avenues for distraction.
Yeah.
What is there that we can eliminate or put some boundaries around so that our minds are able to think and not just automatically go to something easy or fun? But there are so many things available to us that prevent us from having that interior ability to hold a thought for very long without reaching for something.
Would playing music, though, I'm thinking sometimes it does take your time, like your mental effort to concentrate on what you're playing. But right now, my violin bridge is broken, and I keep thinking like, I need to take it into the repair shop. Because
hold on, will you play the violin?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
I did not know this.
Well, yes.
Well, cool.
Yeah. And so picking up a musical instrument or, even just tapping out a little bit on the piano or something like that, right? It's nice to hear my kids play their instruments, and it's nice to be able to practice. And I think of that story of Thomas Jefferson when he was writing the Declaration of Independence, as he was formulating the words and figuring it out. He would stop and play his violin in between sections when he was writing it. And I don't know if that story's true, but he did play the violin, and then he would go back to writing, and then he would play the violin and go back to writing. So I'm wondering if that's not form.
It could be. I have trouble going back and forth. When I sit down at the piano, I want to be there for a while.
Well, you're not Thomas Jefferson though either. So
that is so true. But I was thinking my oldest used to do that. He would get up from whatever he was doing and go play the piano.
Yeah. One of mine does that also.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've seen it happen.
Yeah. I'm wondering if just music is part of that for some people, right? It can be a way to think and behold something.
I think my problem, in general, I have trouble going back and forth between activities in general. So even though I can see how that can be beneficial, I feel like with Scholé, I will get frustrated because I have a hard time picking up where I left off if I get interrupted, which is kind of why I like thinking at night when I'm less likely to be interrupted, because it's hard for me to refine my thoughts sometimes, guys. It's like, poof, gone. So.
Or even just getting into it.
Yeah, true.
Right? Like just like gearing, I mean, that sounds wrong, but like gearing myself up to get into kind of that mode, because it takes some time, right? It's not just like, I'll pick up this book and I'm automatically in Scholé mode. And sometimes my attention span is just not there, or my energy level, or I've been mommed out. And and that's why he says, right, here lies the difficulty.
Yeah, it's true. So let's talk about that second condition, the ability to celebrate a feast, which he leads into on page 25, but he really gets into it in page 26. Why is this so important? I mean, I really think if I was just starting to learn about Scholé, this would not have been the next thing I predicted he would say.
True. And he doesn't develop it here as much as he does in other places. So I felt like for this one, I had to import what he means by celebrate a feast from In Tune with the World.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's true. So if you're listening to this, that's the source material you should go to if you want to think about feasts more.
I'm going to put a note to link to that episode.
Oh, okay. That's true. Because we did have a whole episode on In Tune with the World. So
Yes.
Why is the ability to celebrate a feast so important?
My biggest takeaway from In Tune with the World was that celebrating a feast is a religious affirmation of the world as it exists. And so it lifts us up out of the complaining mode. That's part of what keeps us from being able to celebrate the feast is if we think about our existence, we immediately go into critical mode, not affirmation mode. And even affirmation has a whole lot of modern baggage. I feel like if I use the word affirmation, I have to qualify what I don't mean.
Yeah. Well, and on page 26, he says, what then is required to celebrate a feast? Obviously more than a day off from work. This requirement includes man's willing acceptance of the ultimate truth in spite of the world's riddles, even when this is beheld through the veil of our own tears.
Mm-hmm.
It includes man's awareness of being in harmony with these fundamental realities and surrounded by them. And it goes on to say, to express such acceptance, such harmony, such unity in non-ordinary ways, this has been called since time immemorial to celebrate a feast. And when your books talk to each other, but I ran across this story and it reminded me of this. So Horatio Spafford, he was kind of a real estate tycoon and developer, but he lost everything in the Chicago fire. And he had 4 daughters and 1 son, and his son had died in the previous year before the Chicago fire. His wife and daughters were sent on a trip to England, and he received a telegram saying that there was a shipwreck and that his wife sent him, saved alone, what shall I do? And he got on a ship and he traveled to England to be with his wife. And when he got to the place where they said the shipwreck had happened, he penned the words for the hymn, when peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot has taught me to say, it is well with my soul. So, I was thinking like you are faced with, you've lost everything and, your children, your finances, everything, and you pass over this and you're never even going to get to bury your kids. And faced with that reality, and even through sorrow, he wrote this beautiful poem and was still thankful. And it just made me think of that ultimate truth. And in spite of everything, he was secure in his peace with God and able to pen something beautiful.
Yeah.
That, all of us, the song that we all know.
In 26, he goes on and he says, he's talking about how necessary this attitude of acceptance is and about how it can create within the flow of work days the liberal breathing space that allows us, oblivious of life's more basic necessities, to do what is meaningful in itself. And that oblivious of life's more basic necessities kind of jumped out at me because I was thinking about how, we've talked in the past about festival, and how there are barriers for moms to celebrating those things and what those might be. We talk about that a lot around Christmas, especially. But I was thinking about how the Mary and Martha story, Mary sitting at Jesus's feet, and really, what is it that's stopping Martha from being able to do the same? The scripture tells us that she was cumbered about with much work. I was thinking about how obsessed we can get with our to-do lists and the things that need to be done, and all of those things are important, especially when you're the person hosting the feast or whatever it is. And yet, if we're not careful, life's basic necessities crowding out all the other things. And I know in our modern world, we can crowd things out with digital devices and movies and things like that. And I get that. And yet, on a special day, I don't really have trouble putting down my device. I know some people do, but I'm just saying but my struggle is putting down that mental to-do list that's like haunting me, keeping me from, I don't know, when he talks about the ability to celebrate a feast, that's what I'm convicted about. Like, that's the thing I think holds me back. I've still got that list running of like, I should do laundry or something.
Right. Or if we can have enough dishes, do I need to wash the dishes before the dessert? And I think that's the mentality of the workday.
It is, for sure. I actually met someone one time who went through a period of time where she used things like paper plates for everything, even fancy things. And the reason for that was because she was so obsessed with the dishes, she couldn't calm down. Mm-hmm. And so by eliminating a lot of the dishes, she was able to learn how to enjoy the feast herself. So I was thinking, well, maybe sometimes that's what's needed for some of us, to go to extreme lengths, even though dishes are pretty.
Mm-hmm. But if you don't have the attitude of the feast,
right,
then if you have the accessories of a feast, that doesn't matter as much as having the attitude of the feast.
I like that.
And preparing not just our homes, preparing to celebrate too, knowing that at some point we do need to just put down the work and enter into the festivity itself, doing what you can and preparing for your guests for what's happening, but also being ready to put things down. Because if you just always say, oh, well, I just have to do one more thing, at some point you're just going to have to tell yourself, no, I just need to enter it. It'll be okay.
I have a hunch the work will still be there.
Yeah.
When the food is done and the dessert is done. And
if having people over has taught me anything, it never goes perfectly according to plan anyway.
Yeah.
And it's okay.
Right.
The world still turns. And no one's time is ruined because we had to wash a few dishes, before dessert. I mean, at least in my case, it hasn't.
I just noticed he has a warning for the artists that I think we should read, even though it's not directly related to what we were just talking about. Just because I think it's interesting. On page 27, he says, it is artistic activity especially that can degenerate, either into idle and empty game playing or into some novel and sophisticated form of busyness, profiteering, nervous distraction. If it does not simply sink to the level of crass entertainment apt to seduce man to make himself a prisoner of his work days with no thought of escaping. And I thought, I think that's something that I run into sometimes with things like writing, is like it started out well, but then at some point I had to look something up, and next thing I know, I'm like reading weird articles on Wikipedia, which isn't even a good source of information.
Sophisticated form of busyness.
Exactly.
I'm really good at that.
But I think it's a good warning. He specifically thinks that our artistic activities can degenerate. So our simple things like commonplacing, there's an extent to which they're a little bit safer because there's really good boundaries around them. There's things that are commonplacing and things that aren't. But when you're doing something like writing or painting or whatever, like you have to go get something, you have to, I don't know, there are more places to fall down onto your face. He wants us to have this liberation, he says, and the liberation is from busyness.
Well, I think it's just so habitual for us to enter that workday mode. It's uncomfortable to be in any other mode. So it becomes that magnetic draw very quickly.
So true. Okay, let's take this plane in for a landing. So I am trying to seek Scholé in my life. How do I know if I really have it? And I know we've talked about this through all this, but like, give me the bullet points rundown. How do I know if I really have it? What's your advice to me?
If you've been lost in thought and maybe a little bit uncomfortable in your thinking.
Why uncomfortable?
Because it's alien to that workday mode, the productive, accomplishing something useful mode that we are used to judging actions as being good or bad based on their utility, their usefulness. Contemplation is not useful. It's good in itself. And we aren't used to it. And so it's going to be uncomfortable.
And I think too, finding a point in your day, or at least during your week, write down the to-do list so that it's off of your mind, but then set aside some time for engaging in leisure. I won't say activity, but engaging in this leisure, right? Maybe it's reading, maybe it's writing, maybe it's taking the things that you read earlier this week and actually going through and commonplacing a few things, or playing a musical instrument, something that is just good in and of itself.
Or even those conversations.
Yes.
After reading.
Yes.
Where then you're talking about it to someone else. And that's when the ideas are connecting up and you're having to think through things because you have to express it in your own words. And maybe you get a little bit of pushback or have to define things more carefully. And that forces you to think more carefully and more thoroughly. And that's contemplation, even if it's not silent.
Yes.
That's good to remember. Just like how feasting is not done in isolation.
Right.
Some of these other things don't necessarily have to be. Though admittedly, if you're a painter, you probably want to be alone a certain amount of time.
But I think, when I'm painting,
See, here we go. She plays the violin and she paints. What else do you do, Abby?
I love watercolor. So when I'm painting, as nice as it is to have it somewhere, it doesn't really work in my house. And actually, I like having it because I like my kids seeing that I am engaged in this activity, but it's, something that I'm doing apart from them, apart from school. They're seeing me as a whole person, because I think that's the thing. Leisure really helps us be whole people, right? Like it's not just for a utility purpose. I do art for myself and because I enjoy it. And I think focusing on that and making something that I consider beautiful is something that I want my kids to see. I want them to see that I have hobbies and interests and things like that. And they often will join me. So then we're sitting there quietly doing that. I usually put on music and do it. Though this episode is convicting me that I really need to pick up some of my these other things besides books, right? Music and art.
Yeah, it's easy to let those things go, especially things that require supplies. That's what I found, because you have to have a place to keep them and you have to get things in and out. And then eventually it's like, well, maybe I don't want the hassle. Or at least I do that sometimes. And so then life gets kind of truncated because it becomes the things that are easily accessible.
Yeah.
Otherwise known as the lowest common denominator.
Right. The easy.
Yep. Yay, politics. Just to bring it all full circle.
Politics are not Scholé.
I heard.
Randy.
I heard. Gosh, everybody's a critic. Well, any final words of wisdom, final quotes that you haven't read yet that you wish you had? I have a final quote that I just really liked.
Good. Go for it.
He was talking about, defining the whole world by work alone.
Yeah.
And planning goals and production quotas. So he's like very business minded in this part. And then he says, I love this. There are human activities that by their very nature lie beyond the standards of any 5-year plan. And
which doesn't mean that 5-year plans are bad.
Oh, come on. I knew she was going to defend the 5-year plan.
I also will defend the 5-year plan.
This is like Dickens all over again.
We work so we can have leisure, as Aristotle says. So work that 5-year plan, then you've got a lot of leisure.
Well, I do think he's talking about factory type stuff.
Yeah.
Sometimes when mothers make 5-year plans, it's a little bit less, it's already a little bit less about things that are precisely measurable. I often think about this in terms of husbands. The world treats them as if they are just for the sake of utility, like they exist to work so that the rest of us can have stuff.
In a family.
It's very sad. And like they don't really deserve Scholé time and they're being lazy if they take it. I often think that for career men, everyone tries to quantify them in terms of some sort of 5-year plan. They're supposed to have career goals and aspirations and everything's supposed to lead into that. And if we're not careful, we can buy into that too. That everything needs to be moving towards some sort of ultimate goal instead of,
or just check offable on a box.
yeah, exactly. Well, and I'm thinking really, it's always bothered me a little bit, this notion of utility, because if we are eternal souls, then it's not that these things don't have utility. It's that the utility goes beyond this immediate world and our daily needs of bread and shelter and money and those kinds of things.
Right. Immaterial.
Yes. There are things that are useful to us because we are spiritual beings. I mean, I don't want to muddy the waters because I understand what we're saying when we talk about the useful good and about how this kind of stuff is not in that category. But I just always think, really, if I have a soul, it is useful that I feed it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So anyway, that's my thought on that. Down with the 5-year plan. Just kidding. All right. Anything else before we go?
I think that's good.
All right. Well, thank you, ladies. This has been fun.
Yes. Thanks, Brandy.
Thank you, Brandy.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our upcoming episodes. This season's lineup is great. All of the books and things mentioned in today's episode are linked in our show notes. Just go to scholésisters.com/SS85 to check it out. If you want to think more about what we've talked about today, go grab your free Beginner's Guide to Scholé from our website at scholésisters.com. Our next episode is so interesting. Misty and I had a fascinating conversation with Karen Elliott and Erica Robertson from Rafiki Schools. Rafiki Schools are bringing classical education to many nations on the continent of Africa. Our talk with these ladies was so encouraging. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters.
Get off the politics bandwagon, Brandy. Quit dragging us down. Politics is also not Scholé.
You brought it up.
I know. It's my own fault. I don't think I said
I'm
Trump.
not sure what to do with you. But I'm pretty sure it's your
No,
fault.
you
this
brought
time.
it up. You brought it up. You two brought up the essayist. Stop
Oh,
trying
I
to-
did. You're right.
You
You're
did
right.
it. It's not me. I was like, why would I bring it up? Wait,
You're right.
I wouldn't.
I did. You took the bait. Just kidding.
Oh.
Abby and I have talked a little bit this week about different personality types and what they appreciate or how they might tend to act. And I was just thinking about how TPs tend to be trolls.
That's a new COVID symptom.
I don't know. I don't think I actually had it.
Over 2020 when you almost died of heartburn. I'm going to start watching for that with people who are exposed to COVID.
Now that you have a case study of 2.
Right. It's a pattern.
So anyway, I think you need to cut that.